I left town for exactly 48 hours. That's it. 2 days. Just long enough to watch my daughter get married, walk her down the aisle, embarrass her with a speech I swore I wasn't nervous about, and spend one weekend pretending I wasn't having a full-blown emotional crisis about my little girl becoming somebody's wife. By Sunday afternoon, I was driving back home to Cedar Ridge, a quiet hillside community outside Asheville, feeling pretty good about life for the first time in a while. Then I pulled into my driveway. At first, I thought I'd taken a wrong turn. Seriously, I just sat there with the engine running, staring through the windshield, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Or more accurately, what I wasn't looking at. Because 3 enormous white oak trees that had stood in my backyard longer than anyone could remember were gone. Not trimmed, not damaged. Gone. The lawn looked like a war zone. Deep tire tracks cut through the grass. Mud was packed into the flower beds. Huge chunks of earth had been ripped open where roots used to be. And standing where those trees had been for over a century were 3 raw stumps bleeding fresh sap into the dirt. I got out of the truck and just stood there. The silence hit me first. No verdes. No leaves moving overhead. No familiar creaking branches. Just empty space. You don't realize how much life a tree holds until somebody takes it away. Now, those trees weren't just part of my property. They were family. My grandfather used to sit beneath them every summer afternoon. My mother tied a swing to one of those branches when I was 8. My daughter learned to climb on those roots before she learned to ride a bike. Every major memory I had seemed to trace back to those trees somehow. And now somebody had erased them over a weekend. Then I looked across the property line, and suddenly everything made sense. Or at least the ugly part did. Because where those trees used to block the view, there was now a perfectly unobstructed panorama of the valley below. And sitting beside a brand new infinity pool, holding a wine glass like she was posing for a luxury magazine cover, was my neighbor, Vanessa Mercer. If you've ever met someone who treats the entire world like an inconvenience designed specifically to annoy them, you'll understand Vanessa. She wasn't a bad person in the traditional sense. She donated to charities, hosted fundraisers, volunteered for local campaigns. But she had this way of moving through life that suggested every room belonged to her before she walked into it. A few years earlier, she'd bought the property next door and demolished a historic farmhouse that had been standing since the 1920s. In its place, she built a giant modern mansion made of glass, steel, and enough imported stone to pave a small airport. The house won architecture awards. The neighbors hated it. Vanessa didn't care. And ever since construction finished, she'd had exactly one complaint. My trees. At first, it was little comments. Friendly comments. The kind that sound polite until you realize they're not. You know, those oaks really block the sunset. Or, have you ever considered thinning the canopy a little? Then later, I know a tree specialist who could help you manage them. Manage. Funny word. People always use softer words when they're describing something destructive. I told her no. Every time. Politely at first. Firmly later. Eventually, I stopped explaining altogether. The answer was simply no. Those trees weren't coming down. Apparently, Vanessa had decided my answer wasn't important. I walked across the property line toward her pool. She looked up as I approached. Not surprised. Not nervous. Not even guilty. Just mildly annoyed that her afternoon had been interrupted. I stopped a few feet away. What happened to my trees? She took a sip of wine. Oh, those. Those. Like she was talking about weeds. They were dangerous, she said. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes your brain doesn't know what else to do. Dangerous. Structurally unstable, she replied. Diseased. My consultant identified several hazards. Honestly, I probably saved you from a lawsuit. Histoire de hair. Then at the empty space behind her. Then back at her again. You cut down 3 healthy trees while I was out of town. She shrugged. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. This was a decision. A planned one. A deliberate one. Because nobody hires contractors, obtains equipment, and removes century-old trees by accident. I hope you kept records, I said quietly. For the first time, her smile tightened. We followed proper procedures. Something about the way she said it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Not because it reassured me, because it sounded rehearsed, like she'd been waiting to say it. I looked one last time at those stumps, at the shredded earth, at the valley view she'd wanted for years. And right then, I had a feeling this wasn't just about a neighbor who crossed a line. Something bigger was hiding underneath all of it. I just didn't know what it was yet. But by the time I found out, Vanessa Mercer was going to wish she'd left those trees exactly where they were. That night, I didn't sleep. I tried. I really did. I sat in my recliner with the television on, flipping through channels without actually watching anything. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those stumps again. The thing about losing something valuable isn't always the loss itself. Sometimes it's the feeling that somebody looked at something important to you and decided their convenience mattered more. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep altogether and headed into the attic. Most people use attics for Christmas decorations and boxes they never open. Mine was different. My Aunt Eleanor had been a field ecologist for nearly 40 years, and after she passed away, half her research ended up stored in my house. There were filing cabinets up there packed with maps, surveys, handwritten notes, environmental studies, and enough paperwork to make a tax attorney cry. I wasn't looking for anything specific. Honestly, I was just angry. Angry people dig. Sometimes they find answers. Around 2 in the morning, I pulled out an old county survey from the late 70s. Then another. Then a stack of environmental assessments. And somewhere between my third cup of coffee and complete exhaustion, I found something interesting. The hillside behind our neighborhood wasn't always residential. Decades earlier, before developers arrived, much of the area had been classified as a protected woodland corridor. Most of those protections had eventually changed or expired. Most, not all. I kept reading, and the deeper I went, the stranger things became. There were references to habitat preservation agreements, wildlife migration corridors, native canopy protection, conservation documentation tied to specific parcels of land, including mine. I remember sitting there staring at one page for nearly 10 minutes, because suddenly the story Vanessa had told me wasn't adding up, not even a little. If these records were still active, removing those trees should have triggered a mountain of reviews, environmental assessments, state oversight, federal consultation. None of that happens in 48 hours. Yet somehow 3 protected trees had disappeared over a weekend. That wasn't a shortcut. That was something else. The next morning, I started making phone calls. First the city, then county planning, then forestry services. The answers I got were surprisingly consistent. Yes, there had been an emergency permit. Yes, it had been approved. Yes, a licensed arborist had submitted a report. And according to that report, the trees posed an immediate safety threat. I almost laughed. Those trees had survived hurricanes, ice storms, lightning strikes. One of them had been standing since before automobiles existed. But apparently they all became catastrophic hazards the exact weekend I left town. What incredible timing. The more people explained the permit process, the less comfortable I became. Because on paper everything looked clean. Almost too clean. You ever watch a magic trick where it's obvious something is missing, but you can't figure out what? That's how it felt. Then I met Frank Delgado. Frank worked in county records. He was close to retirement, permanently annoyed, and had the personality of someone who considered smiling a waste of energy, which made him my favorite government employee almost immediately. I showed him copies of the old conservation documents. He spent several minutes reading, then another several minutes frowning. Neither of those things seemed encouraging. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Where'd you get these?" "My aunt's files." He nodded slowly. "Well, that's interesting." Interesting. Never a comforting word. What does that mean? It means somebody approved something they probably should have looked at more carefully. That got my attention. Frank started digging through databases, property records, historical easements, environmental archives. For nearly an hour, he barely spoke. Then he stopped typing and let out a low whistle. Now, if you've ever spent time around older men, you know that a whistle can mean more than an entire speech. I immediately knew something was wrong. What? He turned the monitor toward me. There it is. I stared at the screen. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then it clicked. A conservation easement. Still active. Still enforceable. And attached directly to portions of the habitat connected to my property. My stomach dropped. Not because I was in trouble. Because Vanessa might be. Very, very badly. Frank looked at me. You didn't hear this from me, but if those trees were removed without proper environmental review, city permits aren't going to protect anybody. I left his office with a folder full of copies and a feeling I couldn't quite describe. Part anger, part hope, part disbelief. For days I'd felt helpless. Now for the first time, I felt like the ground beneath the story was shifting. That afternoon, I started researching everything I could find. Federal habitat regulations, conservation easements, protected species documentation. Most of it was painfully boring. The kind of reading that makes legal contracts feel exciting. But buried inside those records was the answer. Those trees weren't protected because they were old. They were protected because they were important. The canopy supported nesting activity for multiple monitored bird species. Native insects depended on the ecosystem. Root systems stabilized portions of the hillside. The trees weren't individual features. They were part of a larger environmental network. Remove them, and you didn't just lose trees. You damaged habitat. And that's where things got dangerous. Not for me. For Vanessa. By sunrise the next morning I had organized everything. Photographs, property records, historical documents, permit information, maps, environmental references. I documented every inch of the damage. The stumps, the excavation marks, the torn soil, the machinery tracks, every detail. Because if there was one thing Aunt Eleanor taught me growing up, it was this. Facts beat emotions. Every time, I wasn't building a complaint. I was building evidence. Then I started making calls. Not local calls. Bigger ones. State conservation offices. Environmental compliance departments. Wildlife agencies. I spoke calmly. Kept emotions out of it. Provided documents. Answered questions. Forwarded photographs. The reaction was subtle at first. Nobody sounded alarmed. Nobody sounded excited. But they kept asking for more information. And that was enough. Because experienced investigators don't get dramatic. They get curious. A few days later, life around Vanessa's property continued exactly as normal. At least on the surface. Pool parties, guests, landscapers, delivery trucks, music floating over the fence. One evening, I watched a group of people standing around her infinity pool, taking photos of the sunset. The sunset she could finally see. The view she'd wanted for years. And for a brief moment, I wondered if I should let it go. Seriously, people always imagine revenge feels satisfying. Most of the time it doesn't. Most of the time, it's exhausting. I could have moved on, planted new trees, accepted the loss, focused on my own life. Part of me wanted exactly that. Then I looked at the empty space where those oaks used to stand. And I remembered something my grandfather told me when I was a kid. If somebody crosses a fence once and nobody stops them, eventually they stop seeing the fence at all. 3 mornings later, I was drinking coffee on my back porch when the first government vehicle arrived. Unmarked. Plain. Nothing dramatic. It parked near Vanessa's driveway. A man stepped out carrying a clipboard. Then another vehicle arrived. Then another. By lunchtime, there were half a dozen people walking her property. Some taking measurements. Others photographing the landscape. One examined the remaining root systems. Another studied drainage patterns near the pool. Nobody looked rushed. Nobody looked confused. They looked focused. And that's when I knew. Whatever had started as a neighborhood dispute was no longer a neighborhood dispute. The system had finally noticed. And Vanessa Mercer had absolutely no idea what was about to happen next. At first, Vanessa treated the investigators the same way she treated everyone else. Confident, relaxed, certain she could explain whatever misunderstanding had brought them there. I watched from my porch as she walked out toward the group carrying a leather folder. Even from a distance, I could tell she was in presentation mode. The smile, the posture, the polished confidence that had probably carried her through 1,000 negotiations. For a few minutes, everything looked normal. People talked. Documents changed hands. Someone pointed toward the pool. Another person pointed toward the hillside. Then something shifted. It was subtle, the kind of thing you only notice if you're paying attention. One of the investigators said something. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw Vanessa's expression change. Just slightly. The smile disappeared. Then she opened the folder again. started pointing at paperwork, talking faster now. Another investigator listened, nodded, then handed her a document. And for the first time since I'd known her, Vanessa Mercer looked uncertain. Over the following week, the investigation expanded. What began with 3 missing trees suddenly included drainage modifications, soil displacement, grading work, imported landscaping materials, and the construction surrounding the infinity pool. Apparently, once environmental enforcement gets involved, they don't examine a single thread. They pull the whole sweater apart. Experts came and went. Biologists, environmental consultants, surveyors, compliance officers. Every few days, another vehicle appeared. Every few days, another clipboard showed up. And every day, Vanessa seemed a little less confident than the day before. Then the findings arrived. I wasn't present when she received them. I didn't need to be. By that point, the entire neighborhood knew something serious was happening. Word spreads fast in communities like ours, especially when expensive houses and bigger egos are involved. The determination was straightforward. The removal of the trees had destroyed a protected habitat area connected to an active conservation easement. The environmental damage extended beyond the trees themselves. The grading work, the landscaping, the excavation for the pool, the disruption of native vegetation. Everything became part of the review. And then came the penalties. A substantial financial fine, mandatory ecological restoration, long-term environmental monitoring. But the part that shocked everyone wasn't the money. It was the restoration order. The pool had to go. Completely. Not modified. Not adjusted. Removed. Every section of hardscape associated with a habitat disruption had to be dismantled. The excavation had to be reversed. Native soil conditions had to be restored. Non-native plants had to be removed. Replacement habitat had to be established under professional supervision. When I first heard it, I honestly sat there for a minute trying to process the irony. The entire reason she'd removed those trees was to improve the view from the pool. Now the pool itself was scheduled for demolition. Life has a strange sense of humor sometimes. A few days later, I saw Vanessa standing beside the water. No guests, no music, no parties, just silence. For the first time since she'd moved into the neighborhood, she looked tired, really tired. Not physically, emotionally, like someone who had finally discovered that not every problem can be solved by writing a check. She noticed me watching. After a moment, she walked over. Slowly. The conversation that followed is one I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. "This is ridiculous," she said. Not angry, not yelling, just exhausted. "They're acting like I committed a crime." I looked past her toward the empty stretch of land where my trees used to stand. Then back at her. "You didn't cut down trees," I said quietly. "You erased something that was already there long before either of us arrived." She shook her head. "I had permits." There was again the same argument, the same shield she'd been carrying from the beginning. Only now it sounded weaker, almost fragile. "I know." She stared at me, waiting, maybe expecting sympathy, maybe expecting agreement. I don't know. What I do know is that for the first time, she seemed genuinely confused, as if she still couldn't understand how following one set of rules had somehow placed her in violation of another. And honestly, that's when I stopped being angry. Not because I forgave her, because I finally understood her. Vanessa wasn't evil. She wasn't some cartoon villain sitting around plotting ways to destroy my life. She'd simply spent so many years getting what she wanted that she'd started believing every obstacle was negotiable, every boundary flexible, every rule subject to interpretation, until she ran into one that wasn't. Over the next several months, the transformation was impossible to ignore. Construction crews returned. Only this time, they weren't building. They were undoing. The infinity pool was drained. Concrete sections were broken apart and hauled away. Stonework disappeared. Landscaping vanished. Equipment moved through the property, reversing years of expensive improvements. It looked less like construction and more like archaeology, as if the land itself was slowly reclaiming something. Meanwhile, environmental specialists began restoration efforts. Native vegetation returned. Young trees were planted. Soil conditions were monitored. Wildlife habitat plans were implemented. Nothing happened quickly. Nature never does. But little by little, the hillside started healing. One morning, nearly a year later, I spotted a small bird perched on one of the newly planted saplings. Not because the tree was mature, not because the habitat was fully restored, just because life has a way of returning when you give the chance. Around 6 months after the enforcement actions became public, Vanessa sold the property. Quietly. No grand farewell. No dramatic confrontation. Just gone. The house eventually sold for far less than anyone expected. Permanent environmental oversight tends to scare away buyers. Turns out luxury real estate brochures rarely advertise regulatory restrictions. The last thing I heard was that she'd moved into a downtown high-rise. No yard, no trees, no conservation easements. Probably safer for everyone involved. As for me, I still live here. Every morning, I drink coffee on the same porch. I still miss those old oaks. I probably always will. Some things can't be replaced. 100 years of growth doesn't come back because somebody plants a sapling. But the story stopped being about trees a long time ago. What stays with me now is the lesson underneath it. The difference between ownership and responsibility. The difference between permission and authority. And, maybe most importantly, the difference between getting away with something and actually being right. Because if we're honest, most people never expect consequences. Not really. We expect loopholes, exceptions, workarounds. We expect the system to bend. And sometimes it does, until one day it doesn't. Now here's the question I still think about. If you were standing where I stood that first day, looking at those stumps, knowing how much time, effort, and stress it would take to fight back, would you have done it? Would you have pushed the issue all the way through? Or would you have accepted the loss and moved on with your life? I'm genuinely curious where people land on that, because even now, I'm not sure everyone would make the same choice. So let me know down in the comments. Was justice served? Or did the punishment go too far? And if this happened in your neighborhood, whose side would you be on?